us for Dust to Dawn Gaming with our deck tech and wrap up for our PTQ prep with one of the 3 decks that can realistically have access to for that PTQ. First of them being Skred Red. For those of you who are not familiar with the archetype, Skred Red is a mono red control based deck based around Blood Moon, one of the more powerful hate cards in Modern. This deck tries to take advantage of the greedier mana bases in the Modern format. A lot of fetch lands, a lot of shock lands, not a whole lot of basics running around with a lot of decks. Some decks like Merfolk or Mono White Hate Bearers don't particularly care about Blood Moon, but a lot of matchups like you can keep the board clear with your Lightning Bolts and the namesake card Skred, as well as your sweepers. Landing a Blood Moon can often KO quite a few opponents. Skred, namesake card of the deck, deals damage to a creature equal to the number of snow permanents you have. Every single one of your lands, the 20 snow-covered mountains and the 2 scrying sheets, are all snow-covered. So it scales with your land drops. So as you draw more lands, powers up. In the early game, it can kill things like Wild Nacatl, Goblin Guide, Monastery Swift Spear, and in late game can kill things even like 7/7 and 8/8 Death Shadows, Tassigurs, Gurmag Anglers, etc. Scrying Sheets, the only other thing notable in the land base, allows you to play 1 in a snow mana to look at the top card. If it's a snow permanent, put it in your hand. Allows you to get through your land pockets in the mid to late game as you're needing to draw gas in certain matchups. When matchups where you're either don't have Blood Moon in or don't have a Blood Moon in play. Relic of Forgiveness, main deck hate against a lot of graveyard decks like Living End or Dredge. Also does well against a lot of the Death Shadow variants. Kind of makes the Delve creatures a lot more difficult to deal, makes Karmaglyphs a lot weaker and more vulnerable to your bolt effects. Mind Stone as ramp and in later game card draw. Boros Reckoner. This is where this version starts to get a little bit different from the traditional lists. A lot of the traditional Skred decks run Eternal Scourge in the slot, and Eternal Scourge is great for grinding matchups, but Boros Reckoner is a lot better if they don't have removal spells for things like Death Shadow, Tarmogoyf. The Delve threats, the Humans deck that's popping up, it's great. Allows you to potentially trade with one of their guys, redirect the damage, kill another guy, or had a few games in the 1 series where they actually dealt 8 to the face off of Thalia's Lieutenant in one of our matchups against the Humans deck. Another card, Sweltering Suns. It's a sweeper. This deck usually runs some number of sweepers in the main deck. A lot of decks run Anger of the Gods for the upside against decks like Dredge that you want to stop them from recurring their threats. I opted for Sweltering Suns as in quite a few matchups the 3 damage to all creatures is kind of not as relevant, so allows you to cycle the card. The 4-drop slot is where a lot of this deck's power comes from. Pian Kirin, 3 bodies. It's basically the red-only version of Lingering Souls. Allows you to randomly sack your relics, your Mind Stones, your Thopter tokens to deal last bit of damage to your opponent or kill off creatures. Koth of the Hammer is a planeswalker that basically only sees play in this deck, but has a lot of utility. His +1 targets a mountain, turns it into a 4/4, so you can get an extra mana out of that or deal 4 damage to your opponent. His -2 is often a ignored ability, but when all of your lands are mountains, it's not hard for him to come down on turn 4, turn 5, minus, and I don't know, play a Glory Bringer or a Wormcoil Lungeon. A little bit ahead of schedule. Chandra, Torch of Defiance. It's been tearing up standard. Excellent card, 4 power, 4 abilities, powerful all the way around. Card draw, extra mana, which can be relevant. Dealing with creatures, its emblem can win the game. Finally, this version goes a little bit bigger than some of the Skred Red decks with Batterskull and Wormcoil Engine, giving you some life gain and resiliency in the late game against decks like Jund, etc. They don't happen to have the Cool Guns commands. And Glorybringer. The 3 different dragons can really be run in the slots. A lot of lists opt for Stormbreath Dragon for its protection from white ability. Some lists run Thermal Hellkite to tap down flyers. I opted for Glorybringer due to the power of its exert ability. In addition to that, as a 5-drop, it evades a lot of the kill spells like Abrupt Decay and Fatal Push, and there isn't quite as many Path to Exiles running around. And quite frankly, your opponent's Path to Exiles are a little strained with, depending on the matchup, the Boros Reckoners, the Glorybringers, and the Worm Coils and the Batter Skulls, so they may not always have Path to Exile for this particular card. Onto the sideboard, you have, obviously, being mono red, you only have a certain amount of options. One of the cards that supplements the Blood Moon plan is Molten Rain. Can come in against decks like Tron or Valakut as a way to slow them down further, or in certain matchups where your opponent has like a couple of basics and grindier control and mid-range matchups, you might bring in the Molten Rains to pick off their basic lands, which is kind of counterintuitive because you want to deal them the 2-land, but it can pick off, their basic planes. Say if they're an Eldrazi and Taxes deck, keep them from casting a lot of the relevant spells. Goblin Rabblemaster as an additional threat in a lot of matchups where against control decks or against combo decks that you're not always the best, you just want to get a fast clock down. More pressure. Kozilek's Return as an additional sweeper. Now the main reason for this is when I was revamping this list from the list gave to me by my brother a long time ago, was Kozilek's Return was mainly for Edge Champion out of Affinity, but with the humans lists popping up, the 4-color human company lists, seeing a lot of core Firewalkers and Orgok champions, if you can time it correctly with their toughness, the Devoid on here really punks those particular creatures as well. Then Ratchet Bomb is a catch-all for 1 and 2 drops, things like Boggles, the humans decks, anything that's trying to swarm the board with 1 and 2 drops, like Affinity as well. Dragon's Claw is for, basically it's for burn. This is probably, outside of a deck like Ad Nauseam, probably the deck's worst matchup because you don't have a fast clock. So even if you land a Blood Moon, if they've gotten you on turn 3, if they've gotten in some chip shots with creatures, you're sitting at 8 or 10 life, it's not very hard, even with cutting them off of their other colors, for them to burn you out. And then Shattering Spree is for decks like Lantern and Affinity. Affinity can be a little bit of a problem if you don't draw your sweepers, so having an additional sweeper to bring in against them is always good. So far we've played 2 leagues with this build of Skred. We've gone 3-2 in both leagues. First league we played against a couple of Affinity builds. We played against a blue-white control deck. We won that match. I was a little bit surprised, but it was a nice hedge. And I can't remember, we played against some weird Through the Breach combo reshape deck that had like Blightsteel Colossi and Emrakul. So this deck, it's positive traits. It's good against decks. The Blood Moon's good. It's good against, generally speaking, it's pretty good against aggro decks and not named burn. You have a lot of, especially in the post-board games, you have a lot of sweepers. You have a lot of interaction for smaller creatures. And then it's pretty good against grinding against the mid-range decks like Jund, Junk. Haven't really been able to test it against Death Shadow yet. Be interested to see how that matchup plays out. But this is one of the options I have for PTQ coming up here at the end of the month. So we'll be having a few more videos coming up with those decks, which are Naya Burn and Ban Eldrazi. This has been Dusk for Dust Till Dawn, signing off for now.